everybody. We're here today for our last webcast of the year. And what a way to end it with Dr. Anil Seth talking about perception and reality. And is our reality just a hallucination? I'm super intrigued by this. I know everybody else is. So just wanted to say hello really quickly, introduce myself. If you don't already know me, I'm Miriam Good, Director of Mind Science Foundation. And today, again, I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Anil Seth, Professor of Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience at the University of Sussex and founding co-director of the Sackler Center for Consciousness Science. And his latest book, which I encourage everybody to get right here, is Being You, A New Science of Consciousness. And it really challenges our understanding of perception and reality. So I know we're all intrigued, so I'm going to minimize myself and let Dr. Seth get started. And we'll be back for Q&A. And just a reminder, put your questions in the Q&A box and say hi in the chat if you'd like. So Dr. Seth, take it away.
Well, thank you, Miriam. It's a great pleasure to be virtually with you all this morning. It's evening time here. I'm speaking to you from Brighton on the south coast of England. And I'm just going to do the share screen dance. And then we should be able to get going. So now it's going to look a bit weird, but if I get to Keynote and do this, hopefully that is all okay, and that you can see the start. Right, okay, so I have half an hour, 40 minutes to talk about consciousness, perception, and reality. So I wanted to start just with this picture of a lab. It's not actually my lab, it's a colleague's lab somewhere on the east coast of the US. And while you're looking at this, I want to ask a question, which is, we're now 2 years into this pandemic, and I'm wondering to myself, am I the same person now that I was then, back in late 2019, made my last trip to the US before the pandemic? It seems to me that I am. There seems to be a strong continuity between myself then and myself now. But in a sense, I can't really be the same person. So much has changed. So much about my social and everyday interactions, like we mainly happen over Zoom now rather than in real life. Am I really the same person? Because that sense of continuity, that's part of what being a self is all about. Now, while I've been rambling on rather undirectedly about that aspect of selfhood, this image has been changing. Now, I can't see a show of hands, but I'd love to know somehow how many people noticed whether that image was changing or not. So just, I don't know, just send it through the ether so I can tell. That's how it started. That was the starting image. And this is how it finished. So many, many things changed in that image while I was talking. And maybe you might have spotted one or two, but I very much would be very surprised if you spotted them all. It's pretty much a totally different scene. Now, this is, of course, an example of a very familiar phenomenon in perception called change blindness. Perception of change is not the same thing as change of perception. Our perceptions can change. That doesn't mean that we always perceive the change. Change is part of perception, just like color or shape or smell. And the reason I use this at the beginning is that I think the same thing or something very similar applies to the experience of being a self, of being you, of being me, of being any self at all. In fact, I think it applies even more so. And I like to call this something called self-change blindness. And the idea is that our minds and our brains are geared by evolution to perceive ourselves as changing less than we actually do, because we perceive ourselves in order to control ourselves. And to leap ahead, the take-home message I want to leave you with today, and that we'll get to at the end of this talk, is that we perceive ourselves, we perceive the world around us and ourselves within it, with, through, and because of our living bodies. And it's this way in which perception of the world and self is manifest. This is why we experience ourselves as changing less than we really do. And we'll see why by the end of this talk. Now, the challenge on the table, and the challenge that motivated this idea of how we understand a self and perception of the world, is, of course, that big challenge of understanding consciousness, of understanding this relationship between a physical, material system, such as a brain and a body, and this private, intrinsically subjective, big and beautiful world of conscious experience and of being a self within it. And as always, it's best to begin these sorts of inquiries with a definition. How do we define consciousness? Well, there's many various sorts of definitions on the table. My favorite starts with Thomas Nagel, and it's a very pragmatic definition. He says an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something it is like to be that organism. In other words, for a conscious creature, it feels like something to be that creature. It feels like something to be me. It feels like something to be you. It probably feels like something to be a bat or an elephant or a kangaroo, but it probably doesn't feel anything like it is to be a table or a chair or a laptop computer. There's nothing going on for those objects. There's no experience. So consciousness here is just synonymous with any kind of subjective experience whatsoever. It's not the same as intelligence. It's not the same as language. It's not the same as self. It is just any kind of experience whatsoever. So it's a very inclusive definition, I think, but it's a good starting point to make sure that we're not talking past each other. Now, given that definition, there is the challenge about how conscious experiences relate to the rest of the physical universe, to matter. And this challenge has been most famously articulated by the Australian philosopher David Chalmers in the form of course, the hard problem of consciousness. And he puts it like this. He says, it is widely agreed that experience arises from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation of why and how it so arises. Why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. That's the hard problem. Now, Chalmers contrasts this with what he calls the easy problems. And these are all the problems about how the brain and body work as a mechanism, how they generate functions and behaviors. Consciousness can be in the vicinity of some of these problems, like how does perception work? How might attention work? But there's a fundamental difference of emphasis. The easy problems are all those problems for which you can basically set consciousness aside and ask, how does the system work as a mechanism? And the intuition that Chalmers is driving at here is that at some future point in neuroscience that we have solved all the easy problems, we understand how the brain works as a mechanism. The hard problem of consciousness, how and why it comes to be part of the universe and relates to the other physical stuff, would be as mysterious as ever. The hard problem would be pristine. Now, because of the grippiness of this apparent hard problem, there are various radical solutions to try and get around it. One radical solution is this idea of panpsychism. Consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous. It's everywhere and to some extent in everything. Now, I don't want to dwell too much on panpsychism, but I don't favor it very much. Its main problem is not so much that it seems crazy. Its main problem is that it explains nothing, cannot be tested, and doesn't even lead to any testable predictions. I think it's an easy out to the hard problem, and there's no need for it. There's a paper there's a book, the best exposition of panpsychism, by the way, is a lovely book by Philip Goff called Galileo's Error. And he solicited a collection of responses, and I had just had a response recently published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. Now, the other somewhat radical response is, I think, more interesting, which is often called illusionism. And this is to say that consciousness doesn't really exist, in brackets, at least not how we normally think of it. And this is more interesting because I think it's like a powerful medicine. If you take just the right amount of it, then you might open yourself up to new ways of thinking about what it is we're trying to explain, what the explanatory targets of consciousness science are. It may not be that we have to explain a conception of consciousness that we might naively come to, for instance, that every experience is experienced by a self. But if you take too much of this medicine, I think you might overdose and end up claiming that consciousness just doesn't exist at all. And that's, I don't think, a good place to end up, because a science of consciousness, indeed any avenue of human inquiry, starts from conscious experience. It is the one thing that we can be sure of, that conscious experiences exist. Everything else is sort of derivative from that. So I don't favor these sort of two extremes, preferring a boring but productive middle ground, which I've called the real problem. And this idea is to take the bull by the horns, accept that consciousness exists, recognize its intimate dependence on the embodied and embedded brain, and just try to figure out what's going on. How can we explain the properties of consciousness in terms of things happening in brains and bodies? That is, in fact, what I've been calling this real problem of consciousness. How can mechanisms and processes in the brain and the body explain, predict, and control properties of consciousness? And these can both be functional properties, like the things we can do in virtue of being conscious, but critically also phenomenological. Like, why is one experience the way it is and not some other way? Why are visual experiences the way they are and not some other way? So you're trying to explain properties of conscious experiences at the level of experience itself. Now, this is neither the hard problem nor the easy problem. It's not the hard problem because we're not trying to directly find this sort of magic stuff that magics consciousness out of mere mechanisms. It's not trying to explain either the existence of consciousness in the universe in the first place. And it's not the easy problem because we're not sweeping the apparent mystery of consciousness away under the carpet. It rather inherits from traditions a bit like neurophenomenology, where we try to go beyond just having brute correlations between things happening in brains and bodies towards explanatory links that connect things happening in brains to bodies. And this, if you like, it's rather than solving the hard problem, the idea here is we're dissolving the hard problem. We're making this apparent explanatory gap between the material and the mental less and less of a gap. Maybe it evaporates altogether in a puff of metaphysical smoke. Now, there are some interesting historical parallels to this, and they're not perfect parallels at all. The main one, of course, that comes to people's minds, and other people have talked about this too, like Patricia Churchland, is the parallel with life. It wasn't that long ago that people thought that the property of being alive couldn't be explained in terms of physics and chemistry. There had to be something else, some spark of life, some élan vital. But of course, that didn't turn out to be the case. Biologists got on with the job of thinking about explaining the properties of living systems in terms of physics and chemistry, like reproduction and homeostasis and metabolism. And then, as a result, the apparent hard problem of life dissolved. It faded away. We no longer even think that it's necessary to search for a special source, a spark of life. Now, this parallel is useful in as much as it gives us a strategy. Let's think about different properties of consciousness instead of consciousness as one big scary mystery. And it's useful historically because it tells us that what was once mysterious might not always be mysterious, but it is not perfect. And I want to just acknowledge that. The main difference is that whereas living systems you can put on the table and look at them and gain and get data about what's going on in the standard ways of science, this is harder for consciousness because the mode of existence of conscious experiences is intrinsic, private, and subjective. You can't put a conscious experience on the table and have a bunch of people look at it. Does this mean that a science of consciousness is out of bounds? Well, no, I don't think it does. It just means, or it mostly means, that the relevant data are harder to collect, but you can still get good data about what people's experiences are like. There's a whole experimental psychology tradition here, a whole philosophical tradition, and you can get on with the job of explanation, prediction, and control. And that, frankly, is what science, that's the bar normally set for science. It doesn't have to be intuitive. It doesn't have to instantiate the property. If you can explain, predict, and control, you're doing enough. Okay, so that's my sort of soapbox preamble about how a science of consciousness might best be pursued. Let's see what happens. So the ways in which I like to divide up consciousness in terms of its fundamental dimensions or properties, basically into three. And these aren't independent, but they're useful to differentiate. So there's conscious level, how conscious we are at any particular time. There's conscious content, what we're conscious of when we are conscious. And finally, a subset, a very important subset of conscious content, is conscious self, this experience of being you or being me. And this is the aspect of consciousness that I think most of us cling to most tightly, the specific experience of being a conscious self in the world. Now, today I don't have time to talk about all of these things. I'm going to not talk about level at all. I'll talk about content and self, and I'll start with content and then move on to self. And let's start our exploration of conscious content by thinking about vision. Vision is sort of where consciousness science got its empirical traction, really, in the early days in the 90s, and it's still a very illuminating place to start. And the first thing to notice about vision, and this is old news, I'm not saying anything new here, you will notice, is that it opens up a gap between how things seem and how things are in our conscious experiences. It's true that our eyes open our brains to the visual world, but of course, the photoreceptors in our retinas are sensitive only to a tiny slice of the full electromagnetic spectrum. Just to 3 parts of that tiny slice as well, 3 different wavelengths. And color-wise, this thin slice of reality is where we live. But even within that thin slice of reality, how things seem in our conscious experience is very far from how things are. This is, I hope this is working on whatever device you're using to watch this webinar. This is a famous illusion called the lilac chaser illusion. It's still one of my favorite illustrations of how things seem can depart from how things are. If you focus your gaze on the black cross at the middle of the screen and try not to blink or move your eyes, then hopefully the magenta patches will all disappear and you'll see a green disc revolve around in a circle. It's working for me at home. I hope it's working for you wherever you are. I'll leave it for a second. Catch our breaths. And now if you blink and move your eyes, the magenta patches should all return. Now this is fascinating for me because there is no green disc. First and foremost, it's fascinating because there is no green disc. There are only magenta patches that are disappearing adjacently one at a time. There are actually 3 different phenomena going on here to explain this lilac chaser illusion. There's Troxler fading, where things in the periphery that have indistinct boundaries fade. There's apparent motion, where things that change close to each other, the brain infers motion between them. Finally, there's color opponency. So when the brain adapts to a particular color and then it disappears, we infer the opposite color in color space. And the opposite in color space of magenta is green, for reasons we can come back to in a Q&A maybe. But it really just serves to illustrate that when it comes to visual experience, what we experience is both less than what's really there. It's this thin slice of the spectrum, but it's also more than, because out of those 3 wavelengths, we generate a universe of color. Now, how do we start to understand this? How do we start to understand what shapes and constitutes our perceptual experiences of the world? The animating idea that I will be talking about for the rest of this webinar is that your brain is a prediction machine, and that what you see, hear, and feel are nothing more than your brain's best guesses about the causes of its sensory inputs. And this is, of course, a pretty old idea. You can go back as far as you like. You can go back to Kant, you can go back to Helmholtz, you can go back all the way to Plato and the shadows cast by firelight on the walls of the cave, the shadows that the prisoners within took to be the real world in Plato's allegory of the cave. And if we update this idea that what we perceive as a prediction and inference about what's out there, we get to something like this. This is a view that I'm going to call, it's called by various things, predictive coding, predictive processing, active inference, the Bayesian brain. But to get the basic idea across, just imagine that you are a brain. Change your perspective. You're stuck inside a bony vault of a skull, trying to figure out what's out there in the world. And there's no light in the skull, and there's no sound. It's completely dark and silent. All you have to go on are streams of electrical signals, which are only indirectly related to things in the world, whatever they may be. So perception, in this case, has to be a process of informed guesswork in which ambiguous sensory signals coming from the sensory organs are combined with prior expectations or beliefs about the way the world is to form the brain's best guess of the causes of its sensory signals. So the brain doesn't see light or hear sound. What we perceive in vision, in audition, in everything is the brain's best guess of what's out there, of what caused the sensory signals that the brain continually encounters. Now, I'll give you one more example before sort of moving on to the more detailed stuff. This is an example I'm sure you will have seen before. It's called Adelson's checkerboard. And in Adelson's checkerboard, these two patches A and B look to be different shades of gray. B looks lighter than A. But of course, it's an illusion. That's not what's happening. A and B are exactly the same shade of gray. And I can show this is true by joining up the two patches with a continuous bar of grayness. And I can move the bar across and you see I'm not cheating. It's the same shade of gray, both patches, but take the bar away and they look different again. So what is happening here? Well, what's happening here is the brain is using its prior knowledge built deep into the visual cortex. And this is knowledge that you as a person, as an agent, are not aware of or weren't aware of, that a cast shadow dims the appearance of a surface. So we see B as lighter than it really is because the brain is trying to infer the causes of the sensory input rather than just measure the light that's arriving at the eye. More formally, what this means is that we can think of perception as a process of Bayesian inference. And this is a very well-known technique, generalizes way beyond neuroscience. It's a way of reasoning with probabilities. And the idea, you can basically think of it as a rule for saying how we should update what we believe now based on new data coming in. So we take something, a prior, what we believe already, likelihood, what's coming in now, to form a new belief, a posterior, what we believe in light of the new data, when everything is uncertain. So this is what the brain is doing, at least at a very conceptual level, when it's doing perception. It's trying to update its beliefs about the causes of sensory signals based on incoming new data. Probably the first person to put this front and center as a theory of perception was Hermann von Helmholtz, and he described perception as this process of unconscious inference, that the brain is what we perceive as an inference about what's out there, not a direct readout of what's out there. And these days we tend to think, and I certainly tend to think, in terms of a mechanistic implementation of this, which we can call predictive processing. And this is a bit of a complicated diagram, but the basic idea is that in the brain, you have predictions about the causes of sensory signals, the blue arrows, which flow in a top-down or inside-out direction, and then prediction error signals, the red arrows, which flow in an outside-in or bottom-up direction from the world to the sensory organs into the brain. And now perception, everywhere, in every modality, all the time, is a continual process of prediction error minimization. The brain updates its predictions or samples new data so that these prediction errors are continually suppressed. And the idea is the content of what we see then is constituted by the top-down predictions, not by the bottom-up prediction errors. And if you think about it, this is quite a radical inversion of how we typically think about perception. Perception seems to be, at least for many people, a bottom-up process in which the world pours itself into our minds through the transparent windows of the eyes to be read out by the self. But what actually is going on is rather different. These signals that come in through the sensory organs aren't reporting directly what's out there. They're just reporting the difference between what the brain expects and what it gets at every level of processing. And furthermore, it turns out that by engaging in this process of prediction error minimization everywhere and all the time, this is a good way of the brain to approximate Bayesian inference. By doing this, you get this. So there's a sort of formal reason why this is a useful thing for the brain to do. But conceptually, I think the main point is that we flip from thinking of perception as a process of reading out the world to the idea that perceptual content is conveyed by top-down predictions, while bottom-up sensory signals convey only prediction errors. Now that's the sort of idea. What's the evidence and what can we do with this idea? Well, there's many experiments. I don't want to bore you with a whole litany of experimental data. I'll just mention one as an example of the kind of thing we can do with this idea. This is a behavioral psychology study carried out with Yaya Pinto a few years ago. And what we did here, we used this technique called continuous flash suppression. And in continuous flash suppression, we show we show to one eye an image either of a house or a face, which gradually ramps up in contrast. And in the other eye, there is a changing pattern of colored squares or oblongs, which gradually reduces in contrast. And by using a stereoscope so that each bit goes to different eyes, what happens is the person begins by seeing the high contrast oblongs, but then eventually sees the image, whether it's a house or face. And what we do is we cue the person to expect either a house or a face, and we measure how long it takes them to see the image and how accurate they are. And across a number of experiments, what we find is that people consciously see more quickly and more accurately that which they expect rather than that which they don't expect. And this is very much in line with the idea. This is what you would expect to happen if perceptual content was conveyed by the top-down predictions, that we see what we expect to see, not what violates our expectations. Now, we want to take this a little bit further. I'm going to jump ahead now to some other more recent things and talk about how we can begin to understand different aspects of our perceptual experience, not just whether we see a house or a face under some highly constrained experimental situation. And this is a method I like to call computational neurophenomenology. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it basically means using computational models to simulate how properties of perceptual experience depend on this process of predictive inference about the causes of sensory data. And one thing that we can begin to think about very quickly is what happens if this balance between prediction and prediction error goes awry. And here we touch on some of the issues mentioned in the abstract about hallucinations and even mental illness. But there's a very general phenomenon by which we tend to see patterns in things. In fact, we particularly tend to see faces in things. Faces are very salient stimuli for us. So our brain projects predictions about faces, that it has a strong prior that a given sensory data is caused by a face because it's useful for us to see faces. So we see faces in clouds, in arrangements of windows, and so on. So we're familiar with this from daily life, but what we wanted to do in a first study was see if we could begin to simulate this in a bit more of a detailed way. So we've been designing what we call hallucination machines, which work by combining virtual reality with machine learning to simulate, in this case, the effects on experience of the brain having very strong predictions, in this case, not to see faces everywhere, but to see dogs everywhere. Formally, what we're doing here is we're taking a classification network that's very good at identifying dogs. This is a deep convolutional neural network. And we're running it backwards. So we're basically fixing the output and updating the input. It's an algorithm based on Google Deep Dream, which came out a while ago. And this was already a few years old, this study now. And this is what it looks like. It's much more powerful if you actually wear the VR headset. This is a panoramic video that we took at the University of Sussex some time ago. And we processed every frame through this algorithm, and we did some continuity stuff. And so the result is that the campus looks rather different than it looks normally. I mean, this is pre-pandemic times, but there are a few too many dogs roaming around here. And what's interesting for me here is that it's not that these dogs are sort of photoshopped into on top of the image. They're coming out of the image in a way that's very suggestive of a kind of organically altered phenomenology. It's not quite like a psychedelic experience. It's neither is it quite like a psychotic hallucination, but it's clearly can be thought of as a simulation of a particular kind of altered phenomenology. And notice we're not talking about the function of consciousness here or what this is good for. We're trying to use computational models to simulate what experiences are like for the experiencer. And that is this idea of computational phenomenology. Now, more recently, just to give you a taste, we're taking this a bit further. This is still work in progress. And we're using a more elaborate neural network that we can set up in different ways. The previous one was just a simple feed-forward network. Here we have a coupled network where there's a feed-forward part to it, but also, which is called a perceptual network, but also a generator network. And the purpose of a generator network is to be able to recreate the input image. And this is actually much closer to this whole idea of the brain as a prediction machine, because to get the brain to work as a prediction machine, we suppose that the brain actually encodes things like generative models that are able to simulate sensory signals. Now, we wanted to use this more elaborate, flexible architecture to simulate different kinds of visual hallucination. Just so the idea here is that when we talk about visual hallucinations, there are many different kinds. There are complex hallucinations that involve objects and people. There are more geometric hallucinations that arise after things like visual loss in things like Charles-Bonnet syndrome. There are psychedelic hallucinations, which often seem to be generated from a seed in the environment. There's the form changes when something's already there. And so we wanted to see if we could simulate these different kinds of simulations by parameterizing the networks in specific ways. And that's basically what we've been doing. Just to show you a visual example of it, here we've got each row corresponds to a different kind of hallucination we're trying to simulate. And each column is the sort of starting image. It's a bird, it's a toadstool, it's a lamp, it's a volcano, it's a flower. And I'm just going to run it, and you can see that as the networks iterate, they end up with very different kinds of images. So they're simulating different kinds of hallucinations. The one on the top, it still comprises objects, but now they're different objects. The one next, it becomes very simple and geometric. And then the psychedelic simulations have this distinctive quality and flavor as well. So this is just to say that we can use these machine learning architectures to try and really get a handle on the space of different kinds of visual hallucinations and altered perceptual experiences. And what we're doing now to close the loop is we're presenting images from these networks to people who do indeed experience visual hallucinations. We have a population of people with Parkinson's disease or Lewy body dementia, and another population, small population of people with Charles-Bonnet syndrome. So this is visual loss, usually macular visual loss, who experience different kinds of hallucinations. And we're asking them just to sort of pick which output of the model best approximates their experience of hallucination. And this is still ongoing, but I think it's a nice way of closing the loop to use computational models of phenomenology to get an insight into what the underlying mechanisms might be in different people's brains that give them different kinds of hallucinatory experience. Okay, stepping back for a second, the overall message from this is that if we can think of hallucination as a kind of uncontrolled perception in which the brain's best guesses are not reined in by sensory data from the world. And by the same token, and this is a phrase I like to use a lot, we can think of perception in the here and now, normal perception, that when we're not having what other people call hallucinations, we are still hallucinating, but it's a controlled hallucination in which the brain's predictions are reined in by sensory signals coming from the world. This is not to say that perception is arbitrary or the mind makes things up. No, it's just to say that the way in which we experience everything is always an active construction, a neuronal fantasy that is geared to reality in ways constrained not by accuracy, but by utility in keeping the body alive. And the deeper claim here is that this doesn't just apply to faces and houses and dogs and whatnot, candles and volcanoes, but it goes all the way through. It goes to every aspect of our conscious encounter with the world and with the self, whether it's taste, color, sound, change, duration, smell, the three-dimensional experience of space, time, even the sense of reality. None of these things should be taken for granted as the brain reading stuff out from the world. They can all be thought of as inferences that brain is making. And I just wanted to mention one other quick thing we're doing here, which has to do with this sense of reality. Now, this is very easy to take for granted that in most cases, we experience the contents of our perception as really existing, even though we know things like colors don't really exist in the world without a mind. But can we find a manipulation where we can play with this sense of reality? And that's what we've been doing here. This is, I'll start it in a second, but we're using a particularly interesting form of augmented or virtual reality that's called here substitutional reality, developed by my colleague Kasuke Suzuki some years ago. And what we do is we take a panoramic video again. Somebody wears a headset and they look through, but then they come to the exact same place in which we took the video, put on a headset, and look around them at the environment. And so what they're seeing is actually real. But then at a certain point, we can switch the feed so that instead of seeing the world through the headset, they now see a pre-recorded version of the environment.
Any glitches? Okay, that's great. Yeah, I'll come back for one last time. Hope everything's going to be right.
I won't let it run forever because we haven't got time. But the basic idea there, we can have a manipulation where people are experiencing an environment that is not real, but they fully take to be real. And then we can ask, how stable is that way of experiencing the world? What does it take to disrupt that experience that things are real? And of course, this has implications for a lot of psychiatric conditions where it's precisely the experience of things being real that breaks down, such as in depersonalization and derealization. Okay, in the last 10 minutes, because I realize I'm going need to get back to that. I want to move on from our experience of the world to our experience of the self. And of course, there are many different ways in which we experience being a self. There's the experience of being a body. Hold on. Oops. Yeah, the experience of being a self. And here, I think the first thing I wanted to say about the experience of being a self is that we want to undercut this intuition that the self is the thing doing the perceiving. It's natural maybe to think there's a world which is sensed by the self, and the self then forms perceptions of this world. But rather, the idea is that both world and self are forms of perception, are forms of controlled hallucination. And there are many different ways in which we experience being a self. I think that's the first thing that flows from this, that there is no unique way of being a self. Again, not a new insight at all. It's very prominent in Buddhism and in bundle theory and philosophy, but there's different aspects by which we all experience being a self, the experience of being associated with a body, the experience of perceiving the world from a first-person perspective, of making intentional voluntary actions, the volitional self. And then finally, the higher levels of the narrative self with a set of memories and plans for the future, and the social self, the way in which the experience of being me is refracted through the minds of others. So all of these aspects of selfhood, I would claim, are varieties of perceptual inference. And I just want to focus on one of them now, which is this bodily self, the experience of being and having a body. And the basic idea, again, is that it's a kind of perceptual best guess. It's a way in which the brain combines prior expectations with sensory data to form a belief, this hand is my hand. And of course, that is the classic example of this experience of body ownership. This is the rubber hand illusion. I'm sure you've seen this before too. In the rubber hand illusion, a person's real hand is hidden from sight and a fake rubber hand is placed in front of them and stroked with a paintbrush. Then when the stroking is synchronous, after a while for most people, there develops this fairly odd feeling that the rubber hand is somehow a little bit maybe part of the body. And this is how it looks in practice. I'm sure you may have seen even this video before, because it illustrates an interesting way to test whether the illusion is working. So it's always fun to show that. But the idea here is that the brain is seeing a hand, it's feeling touch, and it's seeing touch where a hand should be. And that's enough evidence for the brain to make a best guess that the rubber hand is my hand. Actually, that was the story that's the general story for the rubber hand illusion, and that I've been telling for some time. The truth turns out to be more interesting and more complicated, or at least the latest stages of this. And I did just want to mention, because I think it brings up something of general importance here. There's a lot of variability in how strongly people experience the rubber hand illusion. Some people experience it strongly, others don't. I think nobody gets fully convinced that it really is their hand. It's always a bit strange. And so a couple of years ago, we ran with Pete Lush, this work, we ran about 400 people on the rubber hand illusion, but also measured everybody's hypnotic suggestibility or imaginative suggestibility, what we now call their capacity for phenomenological control. In other words, their ability to have experiences that are implicitly or explicitly suggested to them. If you think about the rubber hand illusion, it's a context where there's a strong implicit encouragement to have a particular experience that this hand is somehow my hand. And indeed, it turns out that individual suggestibility is very, very tightly correlated with the strength of the rubber hand illusion. In fact, we now think the rubber hand illusion, and by extension, many of these at first glance very compelling illusions of the body or of perception may be suggestion effects. They may not have to do with the underlying mechanisms of neural integration that people often thought. That may be happening, but certainly suggestion effects seem at the moment sufficient to account for most, if not all, of the data. Because we can think of a suggestion effect as a kind of top-down prediction that's just given by somebody else or by the experimental context. Okay, so I'll finish. The last section anyway is about not perception of the body as an object in the world, this hand is my hand, but this more basic experience of just being a body, being a flesh and blood living organism with all its moods, emotions, and this inchoate basic sense of simply existing. And this aspect of selfhood brings us to a form of perception called interoception. Now, we normally think about sensation and perception in terms of the 5 classical senses that detect signals from the outside world. But a large part of the brain's real estate is dedicated to perceiving and regulating the body from within. And this is called interoception, perception based on sensory signals coming from deep inside the body, telling the brain about things like blood pressure, how the heart is doing, how the gut is doing, and so on. And interoception it's been a little bit overlooked in neuroscience, but it's critical because perception and regulation of the internal state of the body is what keeps us alive, and arguably is what brains are really for, fundamentally for, in evolution and development and in the day-to-day. So to neglect the role of the brain in perceiving and regulating the body is to miss a big part of the story when we want to understand what brains are for and how they work. So what happens? How does the brain perceive and regulate the interior of the body? Well, it's the same story again. The interior of the body is in many ways as indirect, as distant from the brain as is the outside world. The brain only can make inferences about the interior of the body on the basis of sensory signals. So there's another process of inference here, of the dance of prediction and prediction error. But now this dance happens entirely within the body. This is the process I called some years ago. So other people like Lisa Feldman Barrett have talked in similar ways. Interoceptive inference, inference about the causes of interoceptive signals. And it's difficult to get experimental evidence that this is actually going on, mainly because it's difficult to systematically manipulate signals from the inside of the body. But there's an important conceptual thing here, which is that predictions about the interior of the body are generally not about controlling things. Sorry, they're not about finding things out. They are about controlling things. From the brain's perspective, it doesn't care like where the internal organs are or what color or shape they are. It cares how well they're working, how good a job they are doing at the business of keeping the body and the brain alive, and how good a job they're likely to keep doing in the future. So predictions, perceptual predictions about interoception are geared towards control and regulation rather than discovery. You can think of them as more instrumental rather than epistemic predictions. And this distinction rests on a key aspect of predictive processing or active inference, which is that there are 2 ways to minimize prediction error. You can update your predictions, or you can change the data. You can sample the data that conforms to the predictions you already have. This is called active inference. This is what allows predictions or predictive models to be good regulators and good controllers. And there are many ancestors to thinking this way. There's a whole line of thought coming from mid-20th century cybernetics. Every good regulator of a system must be a model of that system. And it also connects very deeply to Carl Friston's fascinating but somewhat murky and a little controversial free energy principle, which basically ends up saying that organisms that maintain themselves in states they statistically expect to be in the long run, that basically stay alive, do so by minimizing free energy, which turns out to be similar to prediction error, which basically means they do so by using predictive models to regulate their interior states. Now, zooming a little bit back out to this question of how we map different kinds of prediction to different kinds of experience, the powerful thing about thinking this way is I think it starts to explain aspects of why particular experiences are the way they are. Visual predictions underpin visual perceptual experience, because visual predictions care about what's there. Is it moving towards me or away from me? What color it is, what shape it is. But interoceptive predictions underpin embodied experience. Emotional experiences have the character of valence. Things are good or bad, or likely to be good or bad in the future, and infinite variations thereof. And these differences, I think, do trace to the different kinds of predictions that are being made. So here we get, I think, a useful illustration of this real problem approach to consciousness. We can begin to explain why experiences have the character that they do in terms of underlying mechanisms. And this brings us right back to where we started, which is where I want to finish, this idea of self-change blindness. Because if predictions about the body are to do with control and regulation, they emphasize stability. The brain expects the body to remain in a stable state over time. And so that stability becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prediction. We perceive ourselves as changing less than we really do because these perceptions of self are geared towards maintaining ourselves, our bodies, in stable states. And I think this applies not just to the deep physiology of the body, but to all aspects of our identity. We perceive ourselves as stable, even though we change, because it makes sense from the perspective of perception as a means of control and regulation. And finally, an implication of all this, if our conscious experiences of the world and self are based on predictions that ultimately are grounded in regulation of the body, then that ties consciousness much more closely to life than we might otherwise think. There's no bright line dividing sort of mindware from wetware. This imperative to regulate the body goes all the way down into cells. So we can think of the mechanisms of, firstly, I think we can only understand consciousness in virtue of our nature as living systems, but it might be that living systems are somehow constitutive of our nature as conscious selves. That is an open question. And it's a very different way of thinking. I have to mention Descartes at the end. Descartes, of course, cleaved the universe into two, but he also said about other animals that without minds to direct their bodily movements, animals must be regarded as unthinking, unfeeling machines that move like clockwork. For Descartes, the flesh and blood living nature of animals was not relevant to their conscious status at all. And I think, and he called them beast machines, and I've come to think exactly the opposite, that because of the origin over evolution, over development, and in the day-to-day, the deep groundedness of our predictive models that underlie all our perceptual experiences in regulation of the body, that we have conscious selves and we have conscious experiences because of our nature as flesh and blood machines. As I put it in the book, we perceive the world around us and ourselves within it with, through, and because of our living bodies. That's where I want to leave it for the talk. I just wanted to flash up names of the people that have contributed to the work in the talk and the book in various ways over the years, and just leave you with a gratuitous advert for the book itself again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anil. That was so much to chew on. I'm not even sure where to start, but we do have a few questions coming in. So I'm going to switch to Q&A. Okay, from Julia. Can you tie in the experience of consciousness more with the first example you demonstrated, how we don't tend to notice that we are constantly changing?
So this is something that I've been thinking about more frequently. For me, it's an aspect of the way we experience the self that I think has not been highlighted that much. So I think one of the strategies that I've come to sort of, I didn't make a decision to follow this strategy, but looking back, this is how I seem to have been thinking, is to draw as many parallels as possible between what we understand about our perception of the world and what we experience as the self, to get as far away as possible from this idea that the self is the thing that does the perceiving and to think of the self as a perception. And change blindness is this very well-known phenomenon in certainly in visual perception. And it just sort of occurred to me that, hold on, that really might explain a fundamental aspect of what being a self feels like. It has this characteristic of stability over time. Part of that is entirely unmysterious. Like, I move from room to room, so of course my visual experience changes because things are changing, but it's the same body going along for the ride all the time. So there is a sense in which the self and the body does change less, and so of course we would perceive it as changing less. But I suspect there is more to it than that, that even though we change quite slowly, I think we perceive ourselves as changing even less slowly. And whenever we see an old photo, this is suddenly dramatically revealed to us, oh, we've changed quite a lot, even though we didn't perceive that change at the time. So it's really the whole approach to consciousness I'm taking is what are the phenomenological explanatory targets? What are the things that characterize experiences of the world and the self? And here I think this experience of stability over time is quite a key aspect of the self outside of context of mental illness and neurological illness. And that can now be understood, or there's a way to think about that in terms of this phenomenon of change blindness applied within. That's how I make the connection.
Great. And would you comment on people who gradually lose vision or hearing? And, can you talk about, I know you were saying that we're always updating our prediction. Our brain is always updating its predictions, but what effect might that gradual loss of hearing or a gradual loss of vision if you're not aware that you're losing it?
I think this is super interesting. I it's another case in which you have some possible form of change blindness. I don't know enough about the empirical data here, but I would imagine that for something like gradual loss of vision or hearing, in fact, people don't realize that things are getting worse for a while until some threshold is crossed, and then it's suddenly revealed. So there may be a kind of change blindness going on there. There was have you ever done this demo? If you get a whole bunch of people of varying ages just to stand up in a space, and then you play this rising tone, and you ask people to just lower they all have their hands up. You ask them to lower their hands when they can no longer hear the tone. And that sorts people into age almost perfectly every time. We are losing our ability to hear constantly. But we don't notice that. We really don't notice that until some threshold is crossed or something becomes very dysfunctional in some way. So I think auditory change blindness is going on always. The other side of that is, of course, that when it gets really serious, like in macular degeneration, where the input becomes very, very deteriorated, well, that's when you get what we would typically call hallucinations, because now the predictions are not being constrained by sensory data, and so the perceptual inference is starting to depart from what others might perceive.
Fascinating. Can you talk about, Allison has a question, what are some of the hallucinations related to Parkinson's that occur?
So they're really very varied. In fact, earlier today, I was on a call with some neurosurgeons from King's Hospital in London who are doing implanted electrodes into Parkinson's patients deep into the base of the brain, into the basal ganglia and subthalamic nuclei, because stimulating in these regions can often resolve some of the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And it's quite common for Parkinson's patients to report hallucinations, though it's not focused on because it's not the primary symptom. The primary symptoms are sort of cognitive and motor control, of course. But they tend to be quite complex. So although they're very diverse, in the interviews that we've done with Parkinson patients, they will report complex scenes. They will report seeing particular figures, family members, friends, and so on. So not geometric patterns, but quite complicated, rich, almost narrative scenes that may not be seeded by what's in their immediate environment. There was one case I was hearing about today where a patient was just hallucinating the presence of their mother there all the time. And that didn't go away when there was a sort of stimulation which resolved the motor symptoms. So it wasn't the same mechanism. There is one thing about Parkinson's hallucinations which has always worried me a bit, which is that sometimes they may be due to the medication that Parkinson's patients are given. And this came up in our meeting today earlier as well. So it's unclear to me whether how much is due to the pathology of Parkinson's disease and how much is due to the medication that's often given.
Great. And how does this tie into dreams? Gary wants to know.
Beautiful question. I mean, dreams are so fascinating, right? I mean, they've been, back to the birth of psychology and psychoanalysis, so important to our lives, yet no consensus on what's going on. I think there's a really nice way of thinking about dreams. They probably don't have one function, probably many, but one function which some people have talked about, Eric Hull has been talking about this and some others, is it's almost like an optimization of the models by which we do perception during the day. So if you think about perception as this process of continual inference, the brain it's got a generative model of what's out there in the environment, it's using that to generate predictions and then updating those predictions, and that's what we see. Now, we know from basic statistics that if you keep fitting a model to new data, you end up overfitting it, and it just doesn't generalize to new situations. You match every data point, swirly line, you miss the trend. And so there's this idea that for perception to keep working and to generalize to new situations, you need to prune the model so that it can generalize more. And there's this quite nice idea that dreaming might be the free running of a perceptual generative model that is doing the pruning, so that it's just, we dream so that we can perceive better the next day.
Fascinating. Okay, we have a question here. Could you say a bit more on the errors produced in the Bayesian sense to modulate perception? Are these errors constants that are added or subtracted for the perceptual inference to develop? Can the brain completely remove or ignore the error about an object that is re-perceived for the truth of the object? Would that say something about the reality of the object outside? I hope I am making some sense.
Okay, I'm going to read that. I've got the Q&A thing up. That's quite a long and detailed question. Yeah, I think so. So this is just to step to the basic thing. So we have this idea of predictions going up, inside out, prediction errors being the sensory data. The first thing to say is that these need not be conscious, right? So when my brain is making an inference about the causes of visual sensory signals, the fact there's a prediction error going on doesn't necessarily give me psychological surprise, like, oh, it's not what I thought it was. It's just all going on under the hood, or a large part of it could be going on under the hood. Now, are they constants? Well, no, they're sort of updated every cycle. So computationally, the idea here is that you have different levels in a hierarchy, and at each level, you'll have a predicted value of the input or the activity at that level and the actual activity at that level, and the discrepancy will be a prediction error. And that, I think, because the baseline for neural activity is 0, I think they're always mainly treated as positive. You can abstract and have negative prediction errors, but neurophysiologically, we think of them as a positive quantity. I think that the really interesting thing here is, can the brain completely remove a prediction error? So there's this interesting consequence of thinking this way, that in principle, maybe the brain could minimize prediction errors completely, and so we would perceive something without any inflow of sensory information whatsoever, because it would already be explained away. I think that's possible in principle, but I don't think it's ever going to happen in practice, because there are always errors. No prediction is perfect. What's more, the data are always changing. And in fact, one of the things that we're interested in the lab is this idea that what really matters for perception is not prediction error in the here and now, but expected prediction error over the future. And so, in fact, we're doing experiments by which we're trying to figure out, can we predict where people, for instance, move their eyes so that they sample data that's most likely to reduce prediction error in the future, even though they don't reduce it now? Because we have to explain, you know, information foraging behavior, why we pay attention to things in particular ways. And I think this is a nice way to think about that.
Wow. This has been just an amazing, amazing conversation. We have time for one more question. And I'm going to go ahead and go to Stephen Dice's question. And this is another kind of detailed question, but have you ever considered that the laws governing nature and the so-called mechanisms we perceive everywhere and that you use to dismiss panpsychism are themselves also part of the hallucination? It is persistent because it works and is adaptive, but are we missing what is real in a cloud of expected mechanisms?
That's a very poetic, beautiful question to finish on. So thank you for that. So, I mean, there's another philosophical perspective here, which I think is close to what you suggested, which is idealism. That, you know, this idea that reality is in fact a property of the mind, of the mental. Which is different from panpsychism. Panpsychism says there is a material world, but consciousness is another fundamental aspect of it. Whereas idealism is the idea that, you know, the problem isn't how mind emerges from matter, but how matter emerges from mind. Indeed, it is true that everything we know about the physical universe, we know because we've had conscious experience of one sort or another, whether it's looking at a number on a computer or looking at the stars through a telescope. That's certainly true, but I wouldn't want to confuse that with a claim about the fundamental nature of reality. And here I'm comfortable to say there is physical reality. We don't know quite what it consists of. Quantum mechanics still hasn't settled on a good answer. It's fascinating that it hasn't, apart from it's really complicated. But I'm comfortable with the position that there is a material world made up of stuff, and some aspects of that world really don't depend on conscious experiences at all. John Locke, the empiricist philosopher, made his old useful distinction between primary qualities, these things that do not require a mind to exist, so things like solidity of an object, and secondary qualities, things which do require a mind to exist. And color is a good example of a secondary quality. Color doesn't exist as an objective property of the world. Cézanne said that color is where the brain and the universe meet. So I think there is a real world, but the way in which we experience that world is always a construction. And it's the thing I'm trying to do is to understand the nature of that construction. The reason I dismiss panpsychism is I think it might be right, but it really doesn't explain anything. And then you get into arguments about how you can't test it, but there's a different problem faced by panpsychists, which is how you combine lots of small conscious things into a big conscious thing. But that's only a problem if you're a panpsychist. It's not really a problem that appears otherwise. So I just don't think it's an empirically productive track to follow.
Super. Well, Dr. Seth, thank you so much. We are so grateful for this time. It feels good to think hard about complicated things, but you express them so eloquently, and we're so grateful for you. Thank you for you and your work, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. Keep your eyes on our website. We have a full year of activities, live and virtual, planned for 2022. So happy holidays, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Miriam, and everybody. It's been a pleasure. I hope it was interesting. Thank you so much.
It was. Thank you.